Emile by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, carrying on. I'm in the middle of the first book. I got this PDF here, so it's not exactly. It's on page 10 on this PDF. Enter sci.ss.uci.edu. We must therefore look at the general rather than the particular, and consider our scholar as a man in the abstract, man exposed to all the changes and chances of mortal life. If men were born attached to the soil of our country, if one season lasted all the year round, if every man's fortune were so firmly grasped that he could never lose it, then the established method of education would have certain advantages. The child brought up to his own calling would never leave it. He would never have to face the difficulties of any other condition. But when we consider the fleeting nature of human affairs, the restless and uneasy spirit of our times, when every generation overturns the work of its predecessor, we can conceive a more senseless plan than to educate a child as if he would never leave his room, as if he would always have his servants about him. If the wretched creature takes a single step up or down, he is lost. This is not teaching him to bear pain, it is training him to feel it. People think only of preserving their child's life. This is not enough. He must be taught to preserve his own life when he's a man, to bear the buffets of fortune, to brave wealth and poverty, to live at need among the snows of Iceland and on the scorching rocks of Malta. In vain you guard against death. He must needs die. And even if you do not kill him with your precautions, they're mistaken. Teach him to live rather than to avoid death. Life is not breath, but action, the use of our senses, our mind, our faculties, every part of ourselves which make us conscious of our being. Life consists less in length of days than in the keen sense of living. A man may be buried at 100 and may never have lived at all. He would have fared better had he died young. Our wisdom is slavish prejudice. Our customs consist in control, constraint, compulsion. Civilized man is born and dies a slave. The infant is bound up in swaddling clothes. The corpse is nailed down in his coffin. All his life long man is imprisoned by our institutions. I am told that many midwives profess to improve the shape of the infant's head by rubbing, and they're allowed to do it. Our heads are not good enough as God made them. They must be molded outside by the nurse and inside by the philosopher. The Caribs are better off than we are. The child has hardly left the mother's womb. It has hardly begun to move and stretch its limbs when it's deprived of its freedom. It's wrapped in swaddling bands, laid down with its head fixed, its legs stretched out, and its arms by its side. It is wound round with linen and bandages of all sorts so that it cannot move. It is fortunate if it has room to breathe, and it is so laid on its side so that water which should flow from its mouth can escape, for it is not free to turn its head on one side for this purpose. The newborn child requires to stir and stretch his limbs to free them from the stiffness resulting from being curled up for so long. His limbs are stretched indeed, but he is not allowed to move them. Even the head is confined by a cap. One would think they were afraid the child should look as if it were alive. Thus the internal impulses which should lead to growth find an insurmountable obstacle in the way of the necessary movements. The child exhausts his strength in vain struggles, or he gains strength very slowly. He was freer and less constrained in the womb. He has gained nothing by birth. The inaction, the constraint to which the child's limbs are subjected can only check the circulation of the blood in the humors. It can only hinder the child's growth in size and strength and injure its constitution. Where these absurd precautions are absent, all the men are tall, strong, and well made. Where children are swaddled, the country swarms with the hump-backed, the lame, the bow-legged, the rickety, and every kind of deformity. In our fear lest the body should become deformed by free movement, we hasten to deform it by putting it in a press. We make our children helpless lest they should hurt themselves. It is not such a cruel bondage certain to affect both health and temper. Their first feeling is one of pain and suffering. They find every necessary movement hampered. More miserable than a galley slave. In vain they struggle. They become angry. They cry. The first words you say are tears. That is so. From birth you're always checking them. Your first gifts are fetters. Your first treatment, torture. Their voice alone is free. Why should they not raise it in complaint? They cry because you're hurting them. If you were swaddled, you would cry louder still. What is the origin of this senseless and natural custom? Since mothers have despised their first duty and removed to nurse their own children, they have had to be entrusted to hired nurses. Finding themselves the mothers of a stranger's children without the ties of nature, they have merely tried to save themselves trouble. A child unswaddled would need constant watching. Well swaddled, it is cast into a corner and its cries are unheeded. So long as the nurse's negligence escapes notice, so long as the nursling does not break its arms or legs, what matter if it dies or becomes a weakling for life? Its limbs are kept safe at the expense of its body, and if anything goes wrong, it is not the nurse's fault. These gentle mothers, having got rid of their babies, devote themselves gaily to the pleasure of the town. Do they know how their children are being treated in the villages? If the nurse is at all busy, the child is hung up on a nail like a bundle of clothes and is left crucified, while the nurse goes leisurely about her business. Children had been found in this position, purple in the face. Their tightly bandaged chest forbade the circulation of the blood and went to the head. So the sufferer was considered very quiet because he had not strength to cry. How long a child might survive under such conditions I do not know, but it could not be long. That, I fancy, is one of the chief advantages of swaddling clothes. It is maintained that unswaddled infants would assume faulty positions and make movements which might injure the proper development of their limbs. That is one of the empty arguments of our false wisdom, which has never been confirmed by experience. Out of all the crowds of children who grow up with the full use of their limbs among nations wiser than ourselves, you never find one who hurts himself or maims himself. Their movements are too feeble to be dangerous, and when they assume an injurious position, pain warns them to change it. We have not yet decided to swaddle our kittens and puppies. Are they any the worse for this neglect? Children are heavier, I admit, but they are also weaker. They can scarcely move. How could they hurt themselves? If you lay them on their backs, they will lie there till they die, like the turtle, unable to turn itself over. Not content with having ceased to suckle their children, women no longer wish to do it. With the natural result, motherhood becomes a burden. Means are found to avoid it. They will destroy their work to begin it over again, and thus they turn to the injury of the race, the charm which was given them for its increase. This practice, with other causes of depopulation, forebodes the coming fate of Europe. Her arts and sciences, her philosophy and morals will shortly reduce her to a desert. She will become the home of wild beasts, and her inhabitants will hardly have changed for the worst. I sometimes watch the tricks of young wives who pretend that they wish to nurse their own children. They take care to be dissuaded from this whim. They contrive that husbands, doctors, and especially mothers should intervene. If a husband should let his wife nurse her own baby, it would be the ruin of him. They would make him out a murderer who wanted to be rid of her. A prudent husband must sacrifice paternal affection to domestic peace. Fortunately for you, there are women in the country districts more continent than your wives. You are still more fortunate. The time thus gained is not intended for another than yourself. There can be no doubt about a wife's duty, but considering the contempt in which it is held, it is doubtful whether it is not just as good for the child to be suckled by a stranger. This is a question for the doctors to settle, and in my opinion, they have settled it according to the women's wishes. Footnote: the league between the women and the doctors has always struck me as one of the oddest things in Paris. The doctor's reputation depends on the women, and by means of the doctors, the women get their own way. It is easy to see what qualifications the doctor requires in Paris if he is to become celebrated. And for my own part, I think it is better that the child should suck the breast of a healthy nurse rather than of a petted mother, if he has any further evil to fear from her who has given him birth. Ought the question, thank you. Ought the question, however, to be considered only from the physiological point of view? Does not the child need a mother's care as much as her milk? Does not the child need a mother's care as much as her milk? Other women, even other animals, may give him the milk she denies him, but there is no substitute for a mother's love. The woman who nurses another child in place of her own is a bad mother. How can she be a good nurse? She may become one in time. Use will overcome nature, but the child may perish 100 times before his nurse has developed a mother's affection for him or her. And this affection, when developed, has its drawbacks, which should make any feeling woman afraid to put her child out to nurse. Is she prepared to divide her mother's rights, or rather to abdicate them in favor of a stranger, to see her child loving another more than herself, to feel that the affection he retains for his own mother is a favor, while his love for his foster mother is a duty? For it is not some affection due where there has been a mother's care. To remove this difficulty, children are taught to look down on their nurses, to treat them as mere servants. When their task is completed, the child is withdrawn, or the nurse is dismissed. Her visits to her foster child are discouraged by the cold reception. After a few years, the child never sees her again. The mother expects to take her place and to repair by her cruelty the results of her own neglect, but she is greatly mistaken. She's making an ungrateful foster child, not an affectionate son. She is teaching him ingratitude, and she is preparing him to despise at a later day the mother who bore him, as he now despises his nurse. How empathetically would I speak if it were not so hopeless to keep struggling in vain on behalf of a real reform? More depends on this than you realize. Would you restore all men to their primal duties? Begin with the mothers. The results will surprise you. Every evil follows in the train of this first sin. The whole moral order is disturbed. Nature is quenched in every breast. The home becomes gloomy. The spectacle of a young family no longer stirs the husband's love and the stranger's reverence. The mother whose children are out of sight wins scanty esteem. There is no home life. The ties of nature are not strengthened by those of habit. Fathers, mothers, children, brothers, and sisters cease to exist. They are almost strangers. How should they love one another? Each thinks of himself first. When the home is a gloomy solitude, pleasure will be sought elsewhere. But when mothers deign to nurse their own children, then will be a reform in morals. Natural feeling will revive in every heart. There will be no lack of citizens for the state. This first step by itself will restore mutual affection. The charms of home are the best antidote to vice. The noisy play of children, which we thought so trying, becomes a delight. Mother and father rely more on each other and grow dear to one another. The marriage tie is strengthened. In the cheerful home life, the mother finds her sweetest duties and the father his pleasantest recreation. Thus the cure of this one evil would work a widespread reformation. Nature would regain her rights. When women become good mothers, men will become good husbands and fathers. That's a good line. When women become good mothers, men will become good husbands and fathers. That is so true. It is imperative. Ashley Judd said the success of Kentucky will depend on the success or the failure of Kentucky's women. My words are vain. When we are sick of worldly pleasures, we do not return to the pleasures of the home. Women have ceased to be mothers. They do not and will not return to their duty. Could they do it if they would? The contrary custom is firmly established. Each would have to overcome the opposition of her neighbors, league together against the example which some have never given and others do not desire to follow. Yet there are still a few young women of good and natural disposition who refuse to be the slaves of fashion and rebel against the clamor of other women, who fulfill the sweet task imposed on them by nature, would that the reward in store for them might draw others to follow their example. My conclusion is based upon plain reason, and upon facts I have never seen disputed, and I venture to promise these worthy mothers the firm and steadfast affection of their husbands, and the truly filial love of their children, and the respect of all the world. Childbirth will be easy and will leave no ill results. Their health will be strong and vigorous, and they will see their daughters follow their example and find that example quoted as a pattern to others. No mother, no child, their duties are reciprocal, and when ill done by the one, they will be neglected by the other. The child should love his mother before he knows what he owes her. If the voice of instinct is not strengthened by habit, it soon dies. The heart is stillborn. From the onset we have strayed from the path of nature. There is another byway which may tempt our feet from the path of nature. The mother may lavish excessive care on her child instead of neglecting him. She may make an idol of him. She may develop and increase his weakness to prevent him from feeling it. She wards off every painful experience in hope of withdrawing him from the power of nature, and fails to realize that for every trifling ill from which she preserves him, the future holds in store many accidents and dangers, and that it is a cruel kindness to prolong the child's weakness when the grown man must bear fatigue. So, that's more of book 1. He gets into a little bit more about the, the separation of the sexes. That was pretty interesting. A good mother, from a good mother will become good husbands and good fathers. So, it's all centered around the mother, and it's about the mother's natural affection. He says a mother's love, while it may be flawed because it is unconditional, goes on forever, it is the same reason why it is the best love, because he would rather err on the side um, of permission, of license, instead of the father's ways, which hurt the child 100-fold. So men hurt the children 100-fold with their ways, but a woman, she may spoil the child, but there's definitely love there. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau thinks from that love is how we can make the ideal man through a good education.